The war table shook when Alaric Stormborn slammed his fist onto it, laughing so hard he had to catch his breath. "Mahuika? My Luna." He wiped his eyes, still chuckling. "Leonidas, tell me you're joking." Mahuika Nightshade froze behind the stone pillar, one hand pressed against the cold wall, the other clamped over her own mouth. She had come to bring him warm tea, the way she did every night before the pack meetings ended. She had not meant to hear this. But her feet had stopped moving the second she heard her own name spoken like a joke. Leonidas Vane, the beta of Ironclaw Pack and Alaric's closest friend since they were pups, leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "I'm not joking, Alpha. The whole pack already assumes it. 3 years, and she still cooks your meals, warms your bed, and waits by that door like a loyal hound." "She's convenient," Alaric said, shrugging like the words cost him nothing. "That's all it ever was. I never once told her I wanted her as my mate. She decided that on her own." Before the story gets even better, press like and comment your location below. It's always incredible seeing people from all over the world watching together. Now, let's continue. Mahuika's chest caved in. 3 years. 3 years of stolen kisses in the training yard, of him whispering her name like a prayer under the full moon, of him promising that one day he would stand before the whole pack and call her his. "She'll be devastated when Seraphine arrives," Leonidas said, his tone almost pitying. "Everyone knows Seraphine was born to be a Luna. Silver blood, perfect bloodline, raised in the Dravenmore court. Mahuika is just a healer's daughter who happened to be nearby when you needed comfort." Alaric's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. He picked up his cup and drank like the conversation bored him. "When does Seraphine's caravan arrive?" he asked instead. 3 days, Leonidas said. "Her father is already preparing the binding announcement." Binding announcement. The 2 words hit Mahuika like claws raking down her spine. A binding announcement wasn't a courtship. It was a promise carved into pack law. The first public step before a mating ceremony. Alaric had never once mentioned Seraphine's name to her. Not once in 3 years. "What about Mahuika?" Leonidas asked, almost as an afterthought, the way someone asks what to do with old furniture before moving into a new den. Alaric was quiet for a moment. Mahuika held her breath so hard her lungs burned. "I'll handle it," he finally said. She knew this couldn't last forever. A healer's daughter was never going to be Luna of Ironclaw. She'll understand. She'll understand. Mahuika's knees nearly gave out beneath her. Somewhere far away, she could hear the wind moving through the pine trees outside the stone hall, could hear wolves howling on the eastern ridge, could hear her own heartbeat pounding so loud she was certain the 2 males across the room would hear it too. She did not wait to hear more. She turned, silent as smoke, and walked away from the door before either of them could sense her scent lingering too long in the hallway. Only when she reached the outer courtyard did she let herself break into a run, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone, tears burning tracks down her face before she even understood she was crying. Her wolf strained beneath her skin, desperate to shift and run until the pain lost its shape, but Mahuika held it back, afraid that if she let go of her human form right now, she might never fully find her way back to it. She reached the edge of the training field and dropped to her knees in the frost-covered grass, gasping like she'd been holding her breath for 3 years and had only now remembered how to breathe. "He never wanted me. He never once wanted me." Somewhere behind her, a horn sounded from the watchtower, the signal for the night patrol to return. Life inside Ironclaw Pack was continuing exactly as it always had, completely unaware that Mahuika Nightshade's entire world had just been reduced to ash in the space of one overheard conversation. She thought of every excuse Alaric had given her, every time he cancelled their evenings together because of pack business, every time he returned smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume and told her it was nothing, every locked chest in his study that he said held boring treaty documents. She had believed him. She had defended him to her own brother more times than she could count. She remembered the winter he'd missed her birthday entirely, claiming a border dispute had kept him at the northern watchtower for 3 days straight. She had waited up anyway, a small cake going stale on the table, telling herself that an alpha's duties came before anything else, that his absence was proof of responsibility rather than a lack of care. When he finally returned, exhausted and apologetic, she had comforted him instead of asking why he never once sent word. She thought of the night she'd asked him, half joking, half hopeful, when he might finally tell the pack about them. He had kissed her forehead and murmured something about timing, about waiting for the right moment, about not wanting to complicate pack politics before he was fully settled into his role. She had accepted that answer 100 times over 3 years, never once questioning why the right moment kept slipping further and further away. Now she understood. There had never been a right moment coming. There had only been Seraphine, waiting patiently in the north, while Mahuika waited just as patiently in the shadows of a wolf who had already promised his future to someone else. The pieces she had refused to put together were finally falling into place, and the picture they formed was uglier than anything she could have imagined. Mahuika wrapped her arms around herself and stared up at the moon, round and silver and indifferent, hanging over Ironclaw territory like it always had. For 3 years, that same moon had watched her fall in love with a wolf who was laughing about her behind closed doors. She did not yet know that this night was only the beginning. She did not know that in 3 days, a stranger named Seraphine Draven would arrive with a smile sharp enough to cut, or that within a moon's turn, Mahuika would be running for her life through unfamiliar forest, with her brother bleeding beside her. All she knew, kneeling in the frost with her heart in pieces, was one simple and devastating truth. Alaric Stormborn had never loved her, and she had wasted 3 years believing he did. 3 years earlier, Mahuika had found Alaric collapsed outside the healing den, half-shifted and bleeding from a border skirmish that had nearly cost him his life. She still remembered how cold his skin had been under her hands, how her own wolf had whined low in her chest at the smell of his blood soaking into the dirt. She had dragged him inside, stitched the gash along his ribs herself, and stayed awake 3 full nights making sure the fever didn't take him. When he finally opened his eyes and saw her sitting there, exhausted and trembling with relief, he had reached for her hand and said the words that changed everything. "Stay with me, Mahuika. I don't want anyone else touching my wounds again." She had been 18. He had been the future alpha of Ironclaw, golden-eyed and broad-shouldered, already carrying the weight of a pack on his back. She had been nobody, just Tauren Nightshade's little sister, the healer's daughter who spent her days grinding herbs and stitching wounds. But for 2 beautiful years after that, Alaric had made her feel like she was the only wolf in the territory. He would sneak away from council meetings just to run beside her under the full moon. Both of them shifted, racing through the pines until they collapsed together in a clearing, laughing and breathless. He would bring her wildflowers from the eastern meadow, claiming he'd simply found them nearby, even though that meadow was 2 days' travel from Ironclaw's borders. "Someday," he had told her once, his forehead pressed against hers, both of them still in human form after a long run. "Someday, I'll stand in front of the whole pack and tell them you're mine. Properly, not in secret anymore." She had believed him with her whole heart. Now, sitting alone in her small den on the outskirts of the packlands, replaying every one of those memories, Mahuika felt sick with how easily she had been fooled. The door creaked open, and Tauren stepped inside without knocking, the way he always did. Her older brother had raised her alone since their parents died in the great sickness 8 years ago, and though he was rough around the edges, there was nothing in this world he wouldn't do for her. He had given up his own courtship with a warrior from a neighboring pack years ago, simply to stay close enough to watch over her, though he never once spoke of that sacrifice aloud. Mauka had only learned of it by accident, overhearing 2 older pack members gossip about how devoted Tauren Nightshade was to his little sister, sacrificing his own happiness so hers could come first. "You missed supper," he said, setting a bowl of stew on her table. Then he noticed her red-rimmed eyes and stopped. Mahuika, what happened? She almost told him. The words sat right at the edge of her tongue. I've been Alaric's mate in secret for 3 years, and tonight I heard him laugh about it with Leonidas. But shame closed her throat before the truth could escape. If she told Torin now, she would have to explain everything. The hiding, the lying, the years spent sneaking through side doors so no one would suspect. Torin had always warned her that secrets built on shadows never held up in daylight. I'm just tired, she said instead. Long day at the healing den. Torin studied her for a long moment, clearly not convinced, but he let it go the way he always did when she needed space. Seraphine Draven's caravan arrives in 2 days, he said instead, settling into the chair across from her. Whole packs buzzing about it. Alpha Alaric's finally choosing a Luna, it seems. Mahuika's stomach twisted so violently she nearly dropped her spoon. Do you know her? She managed to ask. Only by reputation, Torin said. Beautiful, ambitious, comes from strong bloodlines up north. Some say she and Alaric have known each other since they were pups. Their fathers were old allies. He shook his head, oblivious to the way each word was tearing Mahuika apart. Makes sense the Alpha would want someone like that as Luna. Strengthens the pack's standing. Someone like that. Not someone like her. You've gone pale, Torin said, frowning now. Mahuika, seriously, what's wrong? She forced a smile so brittle it hurt her face. Just thinking about all the healing work this ceremony will bring. Big celebrations always mean twisted ankles and too much mead. Torin laughed, easily fooled, and the conversation moved on to safer things. He told her about a warrior in his patrol unit who kept tripping over his own paws during shift training, and Mahuika laughed in the right places, nodded at the right moments, and felt like a stranger wearing her own skin. You sure you're all right? Torin asked again, before he left, pausing at the door with the particular frown he wore whenever his instincts told him something was wrong, but he couldn't quite name it. You've barely touched your stew. I'm all right, she said, truly, just tired. He studied her a moment longer, then nodded and stepped out into the night, and Mahuika listened to his footsteps fade down the path before she finally allowed her shoulders to sag. But long after he left, Mahuika sat alone in the dark, staring at the small wooden box tucked beneath her bed, the one filled with every gift Alaric had ever given her. A braided cord of her own fur from their first shift together, a pressed wildflower from that impossible meadow, a carved wolf pendant he'd given her on the night he first called her mine. She had treasured every single one of these things like sacred relics. Now they felt like evidence of her own foolishness. She thought about the locked study in Alaric's den, the one he never let her enter, claiming it held sensitive pack documents. She thought about the sudden trips he took every few months, always vague about where he was going. She thought about the ring of unfamiliar perfume that sometimes clung to his collar, which he always dismissed as just council business. All of it made sickening sense now. Mahuika pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her own heart, and made herself a quiet, private promise in the darkness of her den. She would not beg. She would not chase him through the pack halls demanding explanations, the way some part of her wanted to. She had already spent 3 years chasing a wolf who never intended to let her catch him. Whatever happened next, whatever humiliation Seraphine Draven's arrival was about to bring, Mahuika would face it standing on her own 2 feet. She just didn't yet know how much worse things were about to get. The morning Seraphine Draven's caravan arrived, Mahuika was called to the Alpha's den to treat a training injury, and found the locked study door standing wide open for the first time in 3 years. Her healer's bag slipped from her fingers. Inside, dozens of portraits and sketches covered the walls, all of the same silver-haired female. Seraphine laughing at some northern festival. Seraphine as a girl, standing proudly beside her father. Seraphine's handwriting, filling pages and pages of letters tied together with blue ribbon. Mahuika's hands trembled as she picked up the nearest bundle of letters, her eyes scanning lines that made her stomach drop further with every word. My dearest Alaric, I count the days until we are finally free to announce our bond to both our packs. The letters were dated back nearly 2 years. 2 years, while Alaric had been telling Mahuika she was the only one who mattered to him. "What are you doing in here?" Alaric's voice cut through the room like a blade. Mahuika spun around, the letters still clutched in her hand, and watched his expression shift from surprise to something colder, something almost annoyed, as though she had caught him doing nothing wrong at all. "You said this room held packed documents," she said quietly. "It's private," he said, crossing the room and taking the letters from her hand with more force than necessary. "You shouldn't have come in here." "I was called for training injuries," she said, her voice shaking now, despite her best efforts to stay calm. The door was open. "Alaric, whose room is this really?" He didn't answer right away, and in that silence, Mahuika finally understood the truth she'd been refusing to accept for 2 full days. "It's her room, isn't it?" she whispered. "You built her a room in your own den. While I was living 3 streets away, hiding every time someone knocked on your door." "Mahuika, 2 years," she said, her voice cracking. "These letters are 2 years old. That means while you were telling me you loved me under the full moon, you were already writing to her." Alaric's jaw tightened, and for one brief moment, something like guilt flickered behind his golden eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold detachment she'd heard in his voice 3 nights ago. "You knew this couldn't last forever," he said. "I never lied to you about who I was going to become. The future alpha of Ironclaw needs a Luna withstanding. You knew that. You told me you loved me. I told you I cared about you," he corrected, and each word felt like a small blade sliding beneath her ribs. "That was never a lie, but love and duty are different things, Mahuika. Seraphine and I were promised to each other by our fathers before either of us could even shift. It was never a question of if, only when." Mahuika felt something inside her chest crack clean in half. "Then why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you let me believe there was a future for us? Why didn't you tell me the truth 3 years ago, before I gave you everything?" For the first time, Alaric looked almost uncomfortable. "Because I didn't want to lose you yet," he admitted quietly. "You made things easier. You made the long nights bearable. You made things easier. Not I loved you. Not you mattered to me. Just easier. A convenience." Exactly the word he'd used with Leonidas 3 nights ago. Mahuika took a slow step back from him, feeling something shift and settle inside her chest, cold and clear as winter ice. "I heard you," she said, 3 nights ago. "You and Leonidas, in the war hall. I heard everything you said about me." Alaric's face went pale. "I heard you laugh," she continued, her voice steadier now, "when Leonidas asked what would happen to me. I heard you call 3 years of my life convenient." "Mahuika, I didn't mean—" "Don't," she said, holding up a hand before he could finish. "Don't you dare stand there and tell me what you meant. I know exactly what you meant, Alaric. You made it very clear." He didn't correct her. He didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, torn between 2 worlds he'd never learned how to fully choose between. And Mahuika realized with a fresh ache that she had spent 3 years hoping he would eventually choose her, when the truth was he had never once been willing to choose anyone at all. Outside, horns began sounding across the territory, 3 long blasts, the traditional welcome for visiting nobility. Seraphine Draven's caravan had arrived at the northern gate. Alaric's eyes flicked toward the window, and Mahuika watched something shift in his posture. A straightening of his spine, a subtle eagerness he couldn't quite hide even now, even with her standing right in front of him with her heart in pieces on the floor. "I have to go greet her," he said. Mahuika laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that surprised even herself. "Of course you do. Mahuika, please, give me time. Let me find a way to explain the situation to Seraphine, to the elders, to—" "There is no explanation that fixes this, Alaric," she said, cutting him off before hope could root itself in her chest again. "Either you choose honesty, or you keep choosing convenience. You've already made your choice. You made it 3 years ago, the moment you decided hiding me was easier than defending me." He hesitated at the door, glancing back at her one final time. Whatever he was searching for in her expression, he didn't seem to find it. He left without another word, his footsteps fading down the stone hallway, leaving Mahuika alone in a room built entirely for another female. She stood there for a long time, staring at the portraits on the wall, before she finally allowed herself to shift. Her wolf form was smaller than most in the pack, a deep russet color that matched her hair, and right now every muscle in that wolf's body was trembling with grief and fury in equal measure. She slipped out through the den's back entrance, avoiding the celebration gathering near the northern gate, and ran until the packlands blurred behind her, and the only sound left in the world was her own paws striking frozen earth. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the sun began sinking behind the tree line, painting the sky the same deep orange as her fur. When she finally shifted back to human form, near a shallow stream, her paws aching and her chest heaving, Mahuika sat on the bank and stared at her own reflection in the moonlit water. She hardly recognized the wolf staring back, hollow-eyed, exhausted, nothing like the hopeful young healer who had once believed a secret love could survive on stolen moments alone. She thought of her mother, who had died healing others during the great sickness, who had taught her that a healer's first duty was always to tend her own wounds before she could properly tend anyone else's. Mahuika had forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, pouring every ounce of care she had into a wolf who had never once thought to ask if she was hurting too. She did not yet know that back at the northern gate, Seraphine Draven had already noticed her absence, and had already begun asking pointed questions about the healer's daughter everyone seemed reluctant to discuss. The welcome celebration for Seraphine Draven filled the great hall with music, firelight, and more silver silk banners than Mahuika had ever seen in one place. She hadn't wanted to come. But Torin had insisted, unaware of everything simmering beneath his sister's forced smile, and refusing would have raised questions Mahuika wasn't ready to answer. "There she is," Torin said warmly, nodding toward the raised platform at the front of the hall. "That's Seraphine." Mahuika's breath caught. Seraphine Draven was breathtaking in a way that felt almost unfair. Silver hair braided with tiny moonstones, sharp cheekbones, a dress the color of midnight that seemed to shimmer every time she moved. She stood beside Alaric with practiced elegance, one hand resting lightly on his arm, and when she laughed at something he said, the entire hall seemed to lean toward the sound of it. Mahuika thought of her own reflection: simple brown hair, plain healer's dress, hands calloused from years of grinding herbs and stitching wounds. For the first time in her life, she felt genuinely small. "Torin, who's that?" Someone called out from the celebration, waving her brother over to join a group of pack warriors. He gave Mahuika an apologetic glance before disappearing into the crowd, leaving her alone near the edge of the hall. That was when Seraphine's eyes found her. Mahuika felt the weight of that gaze like a physical touch, assessing, sharp, entirely too knowing. Seraphine leaned close to Alaric and whispered something. Alaric's expression flickered, just for a moment, before he composed himself and continued greeting well-wishers. A few minutes later, Seraphine appeared directly in front of Mahuika, moving through the crowd with the kind of grace that made everyone else seem clumsy by comparison. "You must be the healer everyone speaks so highly of," Seraphine said, her voice smooth as honey poured over ice. "Mahuika, isn't it?" "That's right," Mahuika said carefully. "I've heard wonderful things." Seraphine's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Alaric mentioned you've kept the pack in good health these past few years. He seems quite fond of your work." There was something dangerous hidden beneath the polite words, and Mahuika understood immediately that Seraphine already knew far more than she was letting on. "I do what I can for the pack," Mahuika said simply. "Of course." Seraphine's gaze swept over Mahuika's dress, her hair, her hands, cataloging every difference between them with cold precision. "Well, I do hope we'll become close, given how much time I'll be spending here now. As Alaric's future Luna, I intend to know everyone important to this pack's future. The emphasis on future Luna was deliberate, sharp as a blade disguised as a compliment. Before Mahuika could respond, Alaric appeared at Seraphine's side, his expression carefully neutral. Seraphine, the pack elders are waiting to formally welcome you. Of course, darling. Seraphine looped her arm through his, though her eyes lingered on Mahuika a moment longer, something calculating passing behind them. It was lovely meeting you, Mahuika. I'm sure we'll speak again soon. Her smile lingered a moment too long, and Mahuika understood it wasn't a promise. It was a warning dressed up as courtesy. As they walked away, Mahuika heard Seraphine murmur something too quiet for human ears, but not too quiet for a wolf's hearing. So that's her, the one you couldn't quite let go of. Alaric's response was too low to catch, but his shoulders had tensed visibly, and Mahuika's chest ached with the confirmation that Seraphine already knew exactly who she was to him, had likely known for a long time. Mahuika slipped out of the hall into the cool night air, needing space to breathe. She found a quiet spot near the training yard, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. You shouldn't have come tonight. She turned to find Alaric standing a few feet away, having followed her out. Your brother invited me, she said flatly. I couldn't refuse without explaining why. Seraphine is perceptive, Alaric said. I need you to be careful around her. If she suspects there's more history between us than there should be, it could cause problems, for both of us. Mahuika stared at him in disbelief. You're worried about my safety, or your reputation. Mahuika, 3 days ago, you laughed about me with your beta, she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. Now you're standing here asking me to protect your secret, so your engagement goes smoothly. Do you hear yourself, Alaric? His jaw tightened. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple, she said. You made your choice a long time ago. You just never had the courage to tell me until I overheard it myself. You could still walk away tonight, she said, glancing back toward the glowing hall behind him. Tell your elders the bond isn't right. Tell them the truth for once in your life. It's not that easy, Alaric said, and the weariness in his voice almost sounded genuine. Ironclaw needs the alliance with Draven territory. Their hunting grounds border ours on 3 sides. If I break this bond now, it could mean open conflict within a season. So it was never about love at all, Mahuika said quietly. Not even with her. It was always about land and grounds and alliances, and I was simply foolish enough to think I mattered outside of all that. You did matter, Alaric said, his voice cracking slightly. You still do. Not enough, Mahuika said. That's the only part that matters now. She turned to walk away, but his hand caught her wrist, gentler than she expected, almost pleading. You don't understand what it's like, he said, his voice low. Being raised to believe your entire worth is measured by what you can secure for your pack. I was betrothed to Seraphine before I even understood what betrothal meant. I never chose her, Mahuika. I inherited her, the same way I inherited this title. That still doesn't explain why you let me believe you were free to choose me instead, Mahuika said quietly. You let me build an entire future in my head, Alaric. You knew it was never real, and you let me keep believing anyway. I never wanted to hurt you, he said quietly. You have to believe that. Mahuika looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up into the golden eyes she had once trusted completely. I believed a lot of things about you, Alaric, she said. I was wrong about all of them. She pulled her wrist free and walked back toward the packlands alone, leaving him standing in the cold, silent night, the celebration still glowing warm and gold behind them both. She did not look back. If she had, she might have seen the flicker of genuine regret crossing his face, regret that would come far, far too late to matter. Mahuika intended to avoid Alaric entirely for as long as she remained in Ironclaw territory. Fate, unfortunately, had other plans. 3 days after the welcome celebration, she was summoned to the Alpha's private study to treat a training wound on Leonidas's arm, a routine task she'd performed dozens of times before. What she hadn't expected was to walk in on Alaric and Seraphine mid-argument, their voices sharp enough to carry through the closed door. "Don't understand why you're being so cautious," Seraphine was saying. "Just formalize the binding now. Why wait until the next full moon?" "Pack tradition," Alaric replied, sounding tired. "The elders expect a proper ceremony, not a rushed announcement." Mahuika knocked, and the argument stopped instantly. Leonidas waved her in, his forearm bleeding from a training accident, and she busied herself with her healer's supplies, trying to become invisible in the corner of the room. Seraphine, however, seemed to have other ideas. "Mahuika," she said sweetly, settling into a chair near the window. "Perfect timing. I was just telling Alaric how curious I am about Pack history. You've lived here your whole life, haven't you? Surely you know all sorts of interesting stories." "I suppose," Mahuika said carefully, focused on cleaning Leonidas's wound. "Tell me," Seraphine continued, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. "Is it true the healer's den sits so close to the Alpha's private quarters? I noticed the path between them looks quite worn, almost like it's used often." The room went very still. Leonidas shifted uncomfortably. Alaric's expression remained carefully blank, though Mahuika noticed his hands had curled slightly at his sides. "The healing den has always been close to the Alpha's quarters," Mahuika said evenly, keeping her focus on the bandage in her hands, refusing to let the slightest tremor betray her. "In case of emergencies, it's practical." "Of course." Seraphine's smile widened, sharp as a knife's edge. "Practical. I do love efficiency." She rose gracefully and crossed to stand beside Alaric, resting a possessive hand on his shoulder. "Darling, I think I'd like to see this healing den myself sometime. Mahuika could show me around, couldn't you? Mahuika, I'm sure you know every corner of it." The threat hidden beneath her pleasant words was unmistakable, wrapped in silk, but sharp enough to draw blood if Mahuika said even one word out of place. Mahuika kept her eyes down, finishing Leonidas's bandage with hands that had gone slightly unsteady. "Of course," Mahuika said, forcing her voice to stay steady despite her unsteady hands, her heart beating in the same frantic rhythm it always did whenever danger drew close enough to smell. She had learned long ago that a healer's calm exterior could hide almost anything, and right now she needed that skill more than she ever had before. After Seraphine finally left the room, trailing her fingers along Alaric's arm as she went, Leonidas let out a low breath. "She knows something," he muttered, once Seraphine was safely out of earshot. "Or she suspects it, at least." "She doesn't know anything," Alaric said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. Mahuika packed up her healer's bag in silence, her hands trembling slightly with suppressed anger. She was nearly to the door when Alaric spoke again. "Mahuika, wait." She turned, and something in his expression made her pause, an exhaustion she hadn't seen before, a weight sitting heavy behind his golden eyes. Leonidas glanced between them, sensing something he wasn't meant to witness, and gathered his things quickly. "Leonidas, give us a moment," Alaric said. Once they were alone, Alaric ran a hand through his hair, looking younger and more uncertain than Mahuika had seen him in months. "I need you to understand something. What happened between us? It wasn't nothing to me. Even now, it isn't nothing." "Then why does it feel like nothing?" Mahuika asked quietly. "Why does every word out of your mouth sound like an apology wrapped around an excuse?" "Because I don't know how to fix what I broke," he admitted. "I was born into obligations I never chose, Mahuika. My bond to Seraphine was decided before either of us could even shift into wolf form. I told myself for years that duty and love could exist separately, that I could give you my heart while giving the pack my hand. I was wrong. And you paid the price for my mistake." She thought of the meadow 2 days' travel from Ironclaw's borders, the one he'd once claimed to have simply found nearby, and wondered now whether that lie had been an early rehearsal for all the lies that came after it. She thought of every wildflower he'd brought her, every one she'd pressed and dried and kept, and felt a fresh wave of humiliation at how carefully she had preserved evidence of her own deception. For one dangerous moment, Mahuika felt the old ache return, the desperate, foolish hope that maybe, somehow, things could still be different, that maybe he would choose her after all. Then she remembered his laughter in the war hall. "She's convenient. That's all it ever was." "You're right about one thing," she said finally. "You did make a mistake. But it wasn't loving me, Alaric. It was letting me believe I mattered enough to fight for." A wolf who truly valued someone wouldn't need 3 years and an overheard conversation to admit it out loud. She left before he could respond, before the treacherous hope in her chest could grow any stronger, before she could convince herself that his regret meant anything at all. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training yard, and Mahuika allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to stand against the stone wall and let silent tears fall before wiping her face clean and walking on. She had a healing den to run, patients waiting for her care, and an entire pack that had no idea their future Luna was already circling her like a predator that had caught the scent of blood. She thought, walking back toward the healing den with her chin held as high as her aching heart would allow, that perhaps this was the true test of everything her mother had taught her, that healing others meant nothing if she couldn't first find the strength to protect herself. Mahuika just didn't yet understand how quickly that circling was about to become an attack. The attack came 7 days later, disguised as an accident. Mahuika was walking home from the healing den after a long shift when 3 pack members she barely recognized stepped out from the shadows near the eastern path, blocking her way with expressions that made her stomach drop. "Mahuika Nightshade," one of them said, a broad-shouldered female named Brenna who worked in the pack kitchens. "We need to talk about Lady Seraphine." "I don't know what you mean," Mahuika said carefully, taking a step back. "Don't play innocent," Brenna snapped. "Word's been spreading, servants talk, you know, about a healer who spends far too much time near the Alpha's private quarters. About a healer who wears an expression like her heart's been broken every time Lady Seraphine's name comes up." Mahuika went very still. Her healer's instincts, trained to notice the smallest shift in a patient's breathing, now screamed a warning far more dangerous than any wound. Someone had been watching. Someone had been listening. And now that someone had turned the pack against her, before she'd even had a chance to defend herself. "Whatever you've heard," Mahuika said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart, "it isn't your business. It's the pack's business when someone threatens our future Luna's happiness," another wolf snarled, stepping closer. Mahuika's wolf rose sharply beneath her skin, instinct screaming at her to shift, to run, to fight. But there were 3 of them, and she was alone, and even a healer's training couldn't prepare her for what happened next. Brenna struck first, her open palm cracking across Mahuika's cheek hard enough to send her stumbling into the dirt. The others closed in, shouting accusations Mahuika barely registered through the ringing in her ears. "Homewrecker, liar, shame on our pack," words that cut nearly as deep as the blows that followed. She curled into herself instinctively, healer's training screaming at her to protect her vital organs, her throat raw from crying out for help that didn't come. Just when the world had narrowed down to pain and dirt, and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, a furious roar tore through the clearing. Torin. Her brother shifted mid-leap, landing between Mahuika and her attackers in full wolf form, teeth bared, a low warning growl rumbling from his massive dark frame. The 3 attackers scattered instantly, wolves twice their size suddenly seeming much less brave. Torin shifted back the moment they were gone, dropping to his knees beside Mahuika, his hands shaking as he gathered her into his arms. "Mahuika, Mahuika, look at me. Who did this?" Through split lips and swollen eyes, Mahuika finally told him everything. 3 years of secrecy, the overheard conversation in the war hall, Seraphine's calculated cruelty, all of it spilling out in broken, tearful fragments, while her brother's face grew darker with every word. "That bastard," Torin snarled, once she'd finished. That absolute coward. 3 years he let you hide in the shadows, and this is how it ends, with his pack beating you in the dirt. Torin, please, Mahuika whispered. Just get me home. He carried her the rest of the way, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Once inside, he tended her wounds with more gentleness than his rough hands usually managed, cleaning cuts and wrapping bruised ribs while silent fury radiated off him like heat from a fire. I'm going to speak with Alaric, he said finally. No, Mahuika caught his wrist. Please, Torin, it won't change anything. It'll only make things worse. He needs to know what his silence cost you. He already knows, Mahuika said quietly. That's exactly the problem. Torin's expression softened with grief as he looked at his little sister's bruised face. I should have seen it, he murmured. All those late nights you claimed were healing work. All those times you seemed happy one week and hollow the next. I should have known something was wrong. You couldn't have known, Mahuika said. I made sure of that. How long have you known her? Mahuika asked quietly, still curled against her brother's side. Seraphine, I mean. Before all of this. Only from a distance, Torin admitted. Ironclaw's warriors trained alongside a few Draven scouts last winter. She seemed pleasant enough then, polished, careful with her words. He shook his head bitterly. I should have known a wolf, that careful with her words, was hiding something underneath them. It's not your fault, Mahuika murmured. No, Torin agreed, his voice hardening. It's his. Every bit of this traces back to a wolf who couldn't find the courage to be honest with either of you 3 years ago. Torin pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, an old habit from when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms. We're not staying here, he said firmly. Not after this. I won't watch this pack tear you apart because some future Luna decided you were a threat to her happiness. Mahuika wanted to argue, wanted to insist that running would only prove her guilt to a pack already convinced of it. But looking at her own bruised reflection in the small mirror across the room, she found she no longer had the strength to fight for a place that had never truly wanted her. That night, as she lay awake nursing her wounds, a soft knock sounded at her window. She opened it cautiously to find Alaric standing outside in human form, having run there in wolf form and shifted back the moment he reached her window. His expression shattered the instant he saw the bruises. Who did this? His voice was low, dangerous, nothing like the composed alpha she'd grown used to seeing. Does it matter? She asked hollowly. Your future Luna's rumors did this. Alaric, whether she gave the order herself or simply let the pack draw their own conclusions, the result is the same. I'll find out who touched you, he growled. I'll deal with them myself. Deal with them how? Mahuika asked, exhausted beyond measure. Punish your own pack for defending your future Luna's honor. Explain to Seraphine exactly why you care so much what happens to me. Alaric had no answer for that, and his silence told her everything she needed to know. Let me at least send you proper healing salves, he tried. The ones from the northern apothecary. They work faster than anything in your own stores. I'm a healer, Alaric, Mahuika said, a tired, humorless smile pulling at her split lip. I have everything I need to treat myself. What I don't have is a reason to keep letting you through that window. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, something like shame passing behind his golden eyes. Go home, Alaric, she said softly, closing the window between them. There's nothing left here for either of us to save. 2 nights later, Mahuika and Torin packed what little they could carry and prepared to leave Ironclaw territory before dawn. There's nothing left for us here, Torin said, tying supplies onto their travel packs with quick, efficient movements. We'll head south, find work with another pack. Somewhere far enough that this whole mess can't follow us. Mahuika nodded numbly, still moving stiffly from her injuries, packing the small wooden box of Alaric's old gifts before pausing and setting it back down. She didn't need reminders of a wolf who had never truly wanted her. They slipped through the western border just before sunrise, shifting into wolf form to move faster and quieter through the forest. Mahuika's russet fur blended into the autumn underbrush as she ran beside her brother's larger dark shape, both of them putting as much distance between themselves and Ironclaw as their legs could manage. The first night on the road, they camped in a shallow hollow beneath a rock ledge, taking turns keeping watch. Mahuika lay awake long after her turn had passed, staring up at the same indifferent moon that had witnessed every secret meeting, every whispered promise, every quiet betrayal of the last 3 years. "Do you regret it?" Torin asked softly, noticing she was still awake. "Loving him, I mean. Even knowing how it ended." Mahuika considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't regret loving him," she said finally. "I regret believing that love alone was enough of a reason to stay hidden. I should have demanded honesty from the very beginning. I should have valued myself enough to ask for that." "You were young," Torin said gently. "Young wolves believe all sorts of things about love, that older, wiser wolves eventually learn better." "Then I suppose I've aged a great deal in the last 2 weeks," Mahuika said, and the dry humor in her own voice surprised her. Torin huffed out something close to a laugh, and for a moment, despite everything, it felt almost like healing. "Where do you think we'll end up?" Mahuika asked, watching the stars shift slowly overhead. "Somewhere far enough south that no one's heard of Ironclaw or Draven territory," Torin said. "Somewhere we can build something new, without anyone's shadow hanging over us." "That sounds nice," Mahuika admitted. "Frightening, but nice." "We've survived worse than fear," Torin said, settling back against the rock. "Get some sleep. I'll take first watch." They made it nearly 2 days before the ambush found them. It happened at dusk, near a rocky ravine, 3 territories south of Ironclaw land. Mahuika smelled the strangers before she saw them. Unfamiliar wolves, at least 5 of them, moving with the coordinated precision of trained hunters rather than territorial patrols. "Torin," she growled in warning, but it was already too late. They struck from both sides, and though Torin fought fiercely, shielding Mahuika's smaller frame with his own body, one attacker's claws caught him deep across the ribs, and another sank teeth into his shoulder, before Mahuika's own desperate lunge tore the attacker away. Blood soaked into the rocky ground, and through the chaos, Mahuika caught a fragmented scent that made her blood run colder than the growing darkness around them, a perfume she recognized from Alaric's locked study, from letters tied in blue ribbon. Seraphine. These weren't random bandits. Someone had sent them. Mahuika fought with everything her small frame could manage, healer's instincts overridden by pure survival, until the attackers, perhaps satisfied that their targets wouldn't survive their wounds regardless, finally retreated into the darkness as quickly as they'd appeared. Her own wolf howled inside her chest, a raw, primal sound of grief and fury that she barely managed to contain, and it took every ounce of her healer's training to force her hands steady enough to be useful. She dragged her brother's massive wolf form into a shallow cave nearby, shifting back to human form with trembling hands to assess the damage. Torin's wounds were severe, but not immediately fatal. If she could stop the bleeding, if she could find the right herbs in this unfamiliar territory, if luck stayed on their side even slightly. She worked through the night by moonlight, using every scrap of healing knowledge her mother had ever taught her, packing wounds with whatever medicinal plants she could identify in the darkness, praying to whatever moon goddess might be listening that her brother would survive until morning. By dawn, Torin's breathing had steadied, though he remained unconscious, pale and fragile, in a way that terrified Mahuika more than the attack itself had. "He almost died protecting me, because of a female who never even knew I was truly a threat to her, not until I became inconvenient enough for her to notice." As Mahuika sat vigil beside her brother, an idea began forming in her exhausted mind. Dangerous, but perhaps their only path to real safety. If Seraphine believed they were already dead, she would stop hunting them. 3 days later, once Torin had regained enough strength to travel slowly, Mahuika used what little coin they carried to bribe a passing trader into carrying false word back toward Ironclaw territory. Word of 2 siblings found dead near the southern ravine, their bodies unrecoverable in the rocky terrain. It felt strange, constructing her own death. Stranger still, imagining how the news might land back home, whether Alaric would mourn her, whether Seraphine would celebrate, whether anyone at all would truly grieve the healer's daughter who had quietly disappeared from Ironclaw's story. "Are you certain about this?" Torin asked weakly, still recovering in the small cave that had become their temporary shelter. "Faking our deaths is no small thing, Mahuika. There's no simple way back from it." "I don't want a way back," Mahuika said quietly, staring out at the unfamiliar forest stretching before them. "I want a way forward, somewhere Seraphine's claws can't reach us, somewhere I'm not defined by what I was to Alaric Stormborn." Torin studied his sister for a long moment, Healer's hands still stained with his own dried blood, eyes carrying a hardness that hadn't existed in her before this journey began, and finally nodded. "Then we go forward," he agreed. "Together." Neither of them could have known that back in Ironclaw territory, news of their deaths would land far harder than Mahuika expected, that Alaric Stormborn would spend 3 sleepless nights refusing to believe it, or that Seraphine's carefully composed grief would crack just enough for a suspicious beta to start asking uncomfortable questions of his own. The story was far from over. It had simply moved beyond Ironclaw's borders, into territory where new alliances and new dangers waited to be discovered. News of the siblings' deaths reached Ironclaw territory on a grey, rain-soaked morning, and Alaric Stormborn received it standing perfectly still in the middle of the war hall, the same room where he'd once laughed so carelessly about Mahuika's devotion. "Dead," he repeated, the word feeling foreign and wrong in his mouth. "Both of them." "That's the report from the southern trade routes," Leonidas said quietly, watching his alpha's face carefully. "A ravine ambush, no survivors found." Something in Alaric's chest cracked open, sharp and sudden, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he'd lost. Not a convenience, not an easy comfort, but the one wolf who had loved him without condition for 3 entire years, whose devotion he had mocked and dismissed until it was far too late to take any of it back. "Leave me," he said hoarsely. Leonidas hesitated. "Alaric, leave." Leonidas lingered at the doorway a moment before finally leaving, his own expression troubled. He had known Mahuika for years, had watched her patch up half the pack's training injuries without complaint, had seen the quiet way she used to look at Alaric when she thought no one else was paying attention. He had laughed about her that night in the war hall too, he remembered now, and the memory sat sour and heavy in his chest as he closed the door behind him. Alone, Alaric sank into his chair, staring at nothing, memories flooding back with brutal clarity. Mahuika's laughter echoing through moonlit clearings, her steady hands stitching his wounds, the way she used to fall asleep against his shoulder after their secret midnight runs, trusting him completely with her vulnerability. He had thrown all of it away for duty, for bloodlines, for a bond decided before either he or Seraphine had any say in the matter. And now the wolf who had loved him most honestly was gone, and he would never have the chance to fix what he'd broken. When Seraphine found him there hours later, still sitting motionless in the darkening room, her expression carried a strange mixture of sympathy and something colder underneath. "Darling, you should eat something," she said, settling gracefully into the chair across from him. "You've been in here for hours." "They're dead because of us," Alaric said flatly. "Because of the rumors that spread through this pack. Because someone decided Mahuika was dangerous enough to warrant violence." Seraphine's expression flickered, so briefly Alaric might have missed it if he hadn't spent years learning to read the subtle shifts in wolves' faces. "You can't possibly blame yourself for bandits attacking travelers, Alaric. That's simply the danger of the roads." "Bandits?" Alaric repeated slowly, something cold and suspicious settling in his gut. Strange, isn't it, that bandits would strike so precisely at 2 siblings who happened to leave Ironclaw territory under such difficult circumstances. "What are you suggesting?" Seraphine's voice remained light, but her eyes had sharpened considerably. "I'm not suggesting anything," Alaric said carefully, watching her reaction with new, uncomfortable clarity. Yet, Seraphine recovered quickly, smoothing her expression back into practiced calm, but Alaric had already seen the flicker of something colder underneath, and he found he could no longer look at her the same way he had only moments before. "You're grieving," she said gently, reaching for his hand. "Grief makes wolves see shadows where none exist." He let her take his hand, but the warmth of her touch no longer reached him the way it once had. Somewhere beneath the surface, his wolf had already begun to pull away from her, sensing a threat his human mind had only just begun to fully accept. Over the following days, Alaric found himself unable to let the matter rest. He questioned the pack members who had attacked Mahuika near the eastern path, the same attack he'd only just learned the full details of, and discovered, piece by piece, a trail of rumors that led back further than he expected. Rumors that Seraphine herself had quietly encouraged, planting doubt about Mahuika's character in careful, deniable conversations with pack servants who then spread the poison further without ever realizing its true source. Leonidas, growing increasingly uneasy himself, brought Alaric disturbing news 3 weeks after the siblings' reported deaths. "There's a wolf named Ivar," Leonidas said carefully, "who's been seen near Seraphine's chambers late at night, more than once. I wasn't certain it meant anything, but given everything else..." Alaric's wolf rose beneath his skin, sharp and dangerous. "Show me." That night, hidden in shadow outside Seraphine's private den, Alaric witnessed exactly what Leonidas had suspected. Seraphine, meeting secretly with a broad-shouldered stranger, their familiarity far too intimate for casual acquaintance. "You worry too much," Ivar was saying, his voice carrying easily on the night air. "The healer and her brother are dead. There's nothing left to threaten your position now." Alaric's blood turned to ice. "Careful," Seraphine warned, though she was smiling. "Even dead rivals cast long shadows if you're not careful, Ivar. But you're right. With them gone, nothing stands between me and becoming Luna. And once you are," Ivar said, stepping closer, "you won't forget who helped make it possible, will you?" Their laughter, low and intimate, confirmed everything Alaric needed to know. He stood frozen in the darkness, understanding with sickening clarity that the female he'd been prepared to bind himself to for life had orchestrated violence against 2 innocent wolves. Wolves who were now dead because of her ambition. He thought of Mahuika's bruised face the last night he'd seen her. He thought of her voice, hollow and broken, telling him there was nothing left here for either of them to save. She had been more right than she ever could have known. Alaric Stormborn stepped out from the shadows, his golden eyes blazing with a fury that made even Ivar flinch. Ivar, to his credit, at least had the sense to look afraid. He raised his hands, his earlier bravado evaporating entirely in the face of an alpha's fury. "I only came to deliver a message about the northern trade routes," he said weakly, though the lie fell apart the moment it left his mouth. "Don't," Alaric said, his voice low and cold enough that even Ivar fell silent. "I heard every word. Don't insult me further by lying to my face." "Alaric," Seraphine breathed, her composure cracking for the first time since her arrival in Ironclaw territory. "This isn't what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," Alaric said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you're going to explain every single detail of it, starting now." The truth came out slowly, painfully, over the course of that long night, as Alaric interrogated both Seraphine and Ivar separately, cross-referencing their panicked explanations until the full scope of the deception became impossible to deny. Seraphine had known about Mahuika from the very beginning, had known for over a year before her arrival in Ironclaw, thanks to a network of informants she'd cultivated specifically to monitor Alaric's activities. Rather than confronting him directly, she had waited, patient and calculating, until her formal binding announcement gave her the pack authority to eliminate the threat entirely. The attack near the eastern path hadn't been spontaneous outrage from loyal pack members. It had been carefully orchestrated, rumors planted with surgical precision to turn Mahuika's own community against her before Seraphine had even officially become Luna. And the ambush in the southern ravine, the attack that had nearly killed Torin and had driven both siblings into faking their own deaths, had been ordered directly by Seraphine, using coin and connections from her family's northern territory to hire wolves with no ties to Ironclaw, wolves who would leave no trail leading back to her. "You could have simply let them leave," Alaric said, his voice raw with barely controlled fury as the full picture assembled itself. "They were already gone, Seraphine. They posed no threat to you anymore." "They posed every threat," Seraphine snapped, finally abandoning her careful composure. "Do you understand what it means to build a life around securing a title, only to watch some healer's daughter threaten to unravel everything with nothing but the past you shared? I couldn't take the risk that you'd change your mind, that you'd choose her over duty after all." "So you had them hunted," Alaric said flatly, "nearly killed." "And it worked," Seraphine said, something desperate and ugly creeping into her voice now. "They're dead, Alaric. Whatever guilt you're carrying, it changes nothing. I did what was necessary to secure our future." "Our future," Alaric repeated, laughing without any humor at all. "There is no our future, Seraphine. There never will be again." He turned to his guards, his voice steady, despite the storm raging beneath his skin. "Take her to the holding cells. Ivar as well. They'll answer to the full Pack Council for what they've done." As guards moved to restrain her, Seraphine's expression twisted from desperation into something far colder, far more dangerous. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "Breaking a binding this far along carries consequences, Alaric, for both of us." "I've already lost the only wolf whose loss actually matters to me," Alaric said quietly. "Whatever consequences follow, I'll accept them. I won't accept living the rest of my life bound to someone capable of what you've done." Seraphine's composure finally shattered completely, her carefully polished mask falling away to reveal something raw and furious underneath. "You'll die alone," she spat. "No pack will trust an alpha who breaks a binding this publicly. You'll spend the rest of your years paying for tonight." "Then I'll pay it gladly," Alaric said. "It's a smaller price than the one Mahuika and Torin already paid." The pack elders convened for 3 full days to determine Seraphine's fate, and Alaric sat through every hour of testimony, forcing himself to hear the complete account of what his silence and carelessness had ultimately allowed to happen. Servants testified about rumors deliberately seeded in kitchens and washing halls. A trader confirmed payment records tracing back to Draven coin. Even Brenna, the pack member who had struck Mahuika near the eastern path, came forward with tearful regret, admitting she had acted on rumors she now understood had been carefully planted rather than organically discovered. "I believed I was protecting my future Luna," Brenna told the council, her voice shaking. "I didn't know I was being used as a weapon against an innocent wolf." Alaric listened to every confession with a growing, hollow ache in his chest, understanding that his own silence 3 years ago had been the first domino in a chain of cruelty that had ultimately cost 2 wolves their entire lives in Ironclaw territory. He had told himself, back then, that keeping Mahuika secret was protecting her from exactly this kind of scrutiny. Instead, his secrecy had left her defenseless the moment scrutiny finally arrived. Word of Seraphine's betrayal spread through Ironclaw territory within days, and the pack's opinion of their soon-to-be Luna shifted violently. When the council finally delivered its ruling, Seraphine's noble bloodline spared her from execution, but she was stripped of her binding claim and exiled from Ironclaw territory permanently, her reputation destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Ivar received similar punishment, banished from the northern territories entirely. Alaric, meanwhile, found himself unable to move forward from the guilt consuming him. He visited the eastern path where Mahuika had been attacked, stood in the healing den she'd once run with quiet dedication, walked the training yard where he'd last seen her broken and grieving because of choices he alone had made. He had spent 3 years treating her devotion as something convenient, disposable, easily dismissed. Only in losing her completely Had he finally understood exactly what that devotion had actually been worth? "You couldn't have known," Leonidas told him one evening, finding his alpha once again sitting alone in the darkened war hall. "None of us suspected Seraphine was capable of something this calculated." "I knew enough," Alaric said quietly. "I knew Mahuika loved me honestly, without condition, for 3 entire years, and I laughed about it. I called it convenient. I let her overhear me destroying everything she believed we had, and I never once tried to make it right before it was too late." Leonidas had no comfort to offer for that particular truth, and the two friends sat together in heavy silence, mourning a wolf whose absence had taught Ironclaw territory a painful lesson about the true cost of cruelty disguised as duty. In the weeks that followed the council's ruling, Alaric found himself unable to sit through a single pack meal without noticing the empty space where a healer's steady presence used to be. He caught himself listening for her footsteps in hallways she would never walk again, reaching for words of comfort he could no longer offer. Leonidas watched his alpha grow quieter, more withdrawn, carrying a grief that no formal apology to the pack council could ever fully repair. "You could try to move forward," Leonidas offered gently one evening. "The pack needs its alpha whole, Alaric." "I know," Alaric said. "I'm trying. It's simply harder than I expected, learning to live with the knowledge that I helped build the very cruelty that destroyed her." Neither he nor Leonidas yet knew that 3 territories south, in the healing dens of Stormfang Pack, Mahuika Nightshade was very much alive, and slowly, carefully, rebuilding a life entirely her own. 3 years passed before Alaric Stormborn learned the truth. By then, Mahuika had become one of the most respected healers in Stormfang Pack territory, her skill with herbs and wounds earning her a reputation that had begun spreading well beyond Stormfang's own borders. Tauren had fully recovered from his injuries and risen to become a trusted warrior under Stormfang's alpha, finally allowing himself to feel settled somewhere new after years of grief and displacement. And Bram Wolfsbane, Stormfang's future alpha, had become something Mahuika never expected to find again after everything Ironclaw had cost her. A steady, honest presence who had earned her trust slowly, patiently, without ever once making her feel like a convenient afterthought. "You're distracted today," Bram said, finding Mahuika staring out over the training field one afternoon, her expression distant. "Just thinking," she said, offering him a small smile, "about how far we've come." Bram settled beside her, close but not crowding, exactly the way he always was. "Good thoughts, I hope." "Mostly," she admitted. She had told him everything, months into their growing friendship, about Alaric, about Seraphine's cruelty, about the years of secrecy and heartbreak that had brought her to Stormfang's healing dens in the first place. Bram had listened, without judgment, and slowly, carefully, had shown her what it actually felt like to be chosen honestly, without hesitation or hidden agendas. It was 3 weeks later that Alaric Stormborn arrived at Stormfang's northern border, requesting formal audience with their alpha regarding trade negotiations. Negotiations that were, in truth, simply an excuse. Rumors had reached Ironclaw territory of a healer matching Mahuika's exact description working within Stormfang's ranks, and Alaric had needed to know the truth for himself. Mahuika was tending a training wound in the healing den when she heard his voice in the hallway outside, requesting to see the pack healer, and her whole body went rigid with shock. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, and the sight of him, older now, lines of grief carved into a face she once knew so intimately, stole the breath from her lungs entirely. "Mahuika," his voice cracked on her name. "You're alive." "Alaric," she said, setting down her healing supplies with hands that had gone unsteady. "What are you doing here?" "I heard rumors," he said, stepping closer, despite everything in his posture, suggesting he expected her to flee. "I had to see for myself. I thought you were dead. I've spent 3 years believing I got you killed." "Tauren and I faked our deaths," Mahuika said quietly. "It was the only way to make Seraphine stop hunting us." Alaric flinched at the name. She's gone, he said. Exiled, 3 years ago, once I discovered what she'd done. The attack on the Eastern Path, the ambush that nearly killed Torin. All of it was orchestrated by her, from the very beginning. Mahuika absorbed this news slowly, watching genuine grief and guilt play across features she'd once known better than her own reflection. Some small, healed-over part of her felt a quiet satisfaction at justice finally finding its way to Seraphine, even years too late. "I'm sorry," Alaric said, his voice raw. "For all of it. For laughing about you in that war hall. For every excuse I made instead of choosing you honestly, the way you deserved. I spent 3 years understanding exactly what I threw away, and it's haunted every single day since." Mahuika studied him for a long moment. This wolf who had once been her entire world, whose casual cruelty had nearly cost her everything, standing before her now stripped of all his previous arrogance, carrying genuine sorrow in eyes she remembered so well. "I forgive you," she said finally, and watched something like desperate hope flicker across his face. "But forgiveness isn't the same as going back, Alaric. That wolf doesn't exist anymore. I'm not her." "Mahuika, I've built a life here," she continued gently but firmly. "One built on honesty, not secrecy. One where I'm chosen, not simply convenient." As if summoned by her words, Bram appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting to careful assessment as he took in the unfamiliar alpha standing before his mate. Mahuika crossed the room without hesitation, taking Bram's hand in hers, and watched understanding and something like relief settle over Alaric's grief-worn features. "You've found happiness," Alaric said quietly. "I have," Mahuika confirmed. "Real happiness. The kind that doesn't require hiding in shadows." Alaric nodded slowly, and for the first time since arriving, something like genuine peace replaced the desperate hope in his expression. "Then that's enough for me," he said. "It's more than I deserve, honestly. I'm glad you're alive, Mahuika. I'm glad you found someone who sees your worth the way I should have, years ago." He left Stormfang territory that same afternoon, carrying with him a closure he'd spent 3 long years desperately searching for, and a lesson about the true cost of choosing convenience over honesty that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Mahuika stood beside Bram in the fading afternoon light, watching Alaric's retreating figure disappear beyond the tree line, and felt something inside her finally settle into peace. "You all right?" Bram asked softly, pulling her gently against his side. "I am," Mahuika said, and meant it completely, perhaps for the first time in years. "I finally am." Later that evening, Torin found her sitting outside the healing den, watching the moonlight settle over the training field where Bram's warriors had trained earlier that day. He sat beside her without a word, the way he always had since they were pups, and for a long moment the siblings simply watched the sky together in comfortable silence. "You did the right thing," Torin said eventually, "forgiving him without going back to him. That takes more strength than most wolves ever manage." "I learned it from watching you," Mahuika said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You never once let anger turn you bitter, even after everything Ironclaw cost us." "Bitterness is heavy," Torin said simply. "I'd rather carry something lighter these days." Mahuika smiled, thinking of how far they'd both come since that terrible night in the ravine. Torin, now a respected warrior, with a mate of his own among Stormfang's ranks, and Mahuika herself, finally standing in a life built on honesty rather than hidden corners and locked doors. She thought of the wooden box she'd left behind in Ironclaw territory, filled with gifts from a wolf who had once made her feel like a secret worth keeping rather than a truth worth telling. She did not miss it. She did not need relics of a love that had required her invisibility to survive. Above them, the full moon began rising over Stormfang territory, silver and steady, the same moon that had once witnessed her heartbreak, now bearing quiet witness to something far better, a healer who had survived betrayal, exile, and grief, and had found, at last, a place where she was never simply convenient, but always, entirely, chosen. "Before you go," I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed today's story, please like the video, subscribe for more heartwarming and unforgettable stories, and tell me what you think happened after the ending. Thanks for spending your time with me. See you soon.